So we have a full slate of 12 game action in MLS match week number 30, and that we're going to be having 8 games on Saturday and 4 games on Sunday. And I'm also wearing an Atlanta United jersey right now, and I'm wearing this jersey for a reason in the match preview, because apparently I have heard a theory where if you are doing kind of like a preview video like what I'm doing right now, and that you basically are doing this video wearing a team jersey, most likely that team jersey that you wear during the preview is going to lose because you just basically jinxed that team. Now, the reason why I want to mention this is because Atlanta is playing against the Quakes. And if that theory is true, then the Quakes would get a huge 3 points in this game against Atlanta. But, you know, it is just a theory, and that I think in some way, whether if you believe in superstition or not, you know, I think it could maybe consider a myth, and that maybe wearing an Atlanta United jersey is just going to give them a better chance of beating the Quakes. And that, you know, with all kidding aside, this game for the Quakes is just, like, unless if they, of course, are going to do something that they have not done a lot this season, which is able to get points on the road, and get points on the road against an Eastern Conference team. And unless if they of course have a Hail Mary kind of game against Atlanta and somehow win this game and pull off one of the biggest surprise this season, Atlanta most likely is going to win this game, and that they are heavy favorites in this one. And also, not to mention the fact that the Quakes, there are a couple of things that is going to be against them in this game. One of the things that's going to be against them is that they have lost 6 in a row on the road. I mean, they have not won a road game since they beat Vancouver back in July, and that this has kind of started to look like the old Quakes, where whenever they are going on the road, yeah, it usually is going to be an automatic loss. Which, speaking of an automatic loss, that brings me the second thing that goes against for the Quakes in this game, is that this game is a road game against an Eastern Conference team. And a win against an Eastern Conference team, or even getting a point out of an Eastern Conference team, is incredibly rare kind of sighting for the Quakes to do. Like, I know this season they of course did get a win against an Eastern Conference team, which was against Toronto, but that was the first time in 4 years that we were able to beat an Eastern Conference team on the road. And in many ways, it's almost like a once in a half-decade kind of spectacle that the Quakes would somehow get all 3 points against an Eastern Conference team. So, yeah, that, of course, is going to be going against the Quakes. But at least, as much as I know, I'm kind of being negative and saying that we most likely is not going to get anything out of this one, I will say that the hopes that I have with the Quakes in this game is, obviously, hopefully that theory of me saying that me wearing this Atlanta United jersey would just jinx Atlanta United of winning this game, and that the Quakes would somehow walk out Mercedes-Benz Stadium with all 3 points, is that, you know, Atlanta, they of course have a short week to prepare for this, because they of course beat FC Cincinnati away just 3 days ago, and that the Quakes, you know, while they did lose that last match against NYCFC on the road, that was a week ago. So they have a whole week to prepare for this match, and that fatigue should definitely not be an issue with this team. And the other thing that could maybe go in favor of the Quakes is that Atlanta did lose their last home game against Columbus, which is one of the more surprising results of this season. Although you could also maybe look at that as saying maybe that could also go against the Quakes, because you know Atlanta is not going to be very happy with the way that they lost that last match to Columbus, and that, you know, Atlanta, they usually do not drop back-to-back home games, and I actually don't even know if they have actually dropped back-to-back home games, at least at Mercedes-Benz Stadium too, because they've been winning so much at that arena, and that it's just one of the hardest plays to actually get not just 3 points out of the game, but even get a point out of this game. Now, in terms of the playoff implication in this game, there's definitely some big playoff implication for both teams. Obviously, for Atlanta, you know, the good news is they are secure their spot of making the playoffs once again. But, you know, they knew that in the beginning of the season that they, of course, are making the playoffs. But their expectation is definitely finish at the top of the Eastern Conference. And right now, they're currently 1 point behind Philly for second place, while they are 6 points behind NYCFC for that top spot. Now, keep in mind, they will play NYCFC in a couple of weeks at Yankee Stadium, so that could potentially be a 3-point gap if they beat NYCFC in this game. But knowing the fact that they also got to make sure that there's no margin for error if they want to catch NYCFC for that top spot in the Eastern Conference, which is why they just cannot afford to lose this game or even draw this game against the Quakes if they want to get that first round bye this season. Well, the Quakes, they are part of that logjam of the Western Conference where they're only 1 point above the red line and 1 point above Portland for this game, and that, you know, if they do lose this game, and depending on if Portland and Dallas is able to get resort or get a draw this game, all of a sudden the Quakes could be finding themselves looking on the outside in, and that, you know, the schedule does not get any easier for the Quakes with them have to play Philly next, and then they have to play Seattle in following the next game. Now, the good news is this is going to be the last game out of the 3-game road trip that the Quakes are going to be playing, and that those next 2 tough games is going to be at home. And, you know, home form, I really think, is going to be the ultimate decider in terms of whether or not if the Quakes are going to be making the playoffs or not. I mean, I know the ultimate decider maybe will come down to the final game of the season when they have to go to Providence Park and play against the Timbers on the road, and that there could be a scenario where they have to win that game to move on into the playoffs. But knowing the fact that, you know, when you look at that game and how the Quakes have never beat Portland on the road, I just think that could be something similar to this game where there's going to be a lot of things that is going to be against us, and I just hope we don't wait until the final day of the season where our playoff lines could potentially be at stake. And to improve that chance of not having that scenario where our playoff hopes is on the line on the final day, get at least a point or even get all 3 points in this game against Atlanta United. Now, moving on into the next match is the meaningless game of the week. So last week, Vancouver was involved of the most meaningless game of the week against Houston because, you know, Vancouver is already eliminated and the team that they're facing against is on the verge of getting eliminated. Well, this week it's basically deja vu all over again because Vancouver, who's already eliminated from the playoffs, is going to be facing a team that is also on the verge of getting eliminated, which is the Columbus Crew. And that Vancouver, of course, they did win 2-1 in that meaningless game against Houston at home. And Columbus, of course, pull off a very surprising result against Atlanta away by winning 3-1. But obviously, with Columbus 6 points out of the playoffs and 6 points behind New England in that playoff picture, and they also have played one more game than what New England has. You know, if they do not win this game or if they lose this game and New England is able to get a win or a draw in the game against RSL, then they would be officially eliminated from the playoffs. Now, unlike that Vancouver versus Houston game where I kind of predict Vancouver is going to win because I'm guessing since Houston is not very good on the road and facing a Vancouver team that is somewhat respectable at home, even though they're not as good as they would be when you see a team that should potentially be fighting for a playoff position at home. You know, they're about to face against a Columbus team that in the last couple of weeks, they have definitely have that never say die mentality, and that despite the fact that 15-game winless run that pretty much ruined their chances of making the playoffs, and that once that winless run happened, I knew that they were done for their season and there's just no way they can climb themselves back. Well, they kind of had started to climb themselves back and at least get very close, and probably as close as they have ever been since they went on just a tailspin of losses. But unfortunately for Columbus, you know, I just think it's just too late for them in terms of making the playoffs, and that I guess the only thing that they have left to play for is pride, and that, you know, with them having such a good run at the latter part of the season, you wonder, is this team could be a contender kind of team heading into next season. Now, moving on into the next match is going to be FC Cincinnati versus Chicago. And the next free match that I'm going to be talking about has something very in common, which is that the next free game is going to be featuring teams that is going to be battling for that last spot of the playoffs. And in many ways, you know, for Chicago and Orlando City, you know, those two teams that is fighting for New England for that last spot of the playoffs, they are definitely giving some very easy game, with Chicago getting the so-called free point of the week, playing against the worst team on the road in this game, and that Orlando City play against a Dynamo team that is pretty much dead and buried in terms of their season. So, you know, this could be an interesting to see what both of these teams can do, and that, you know, if both of these teams, of course, win their game this week, and that New England find themselves losing this week, then all of a sudden Chicago could actually be tied with New England for that last spot of the playoffs. And by the way, Montreal is another team that is kind of like in this hunt, and I know I've been kind of being a little bit harsh and being kind of a little bit disrespectful to a lot of Impact fans about the fact that their team have no chance of making the playoffs, even though they're in terms of the gap between them and New England for that last spot is basically the same as Chicago's gap. But I'll get to Montreal cases as I'll talk about the games that they will have coming up once I of course switch board and look at the last game of this match week. But focusing on this game between Cincinnati versus Chicago, like I said, it's the free points of the week that Chicago gets to enjoy in this week. Although I will say this, FC Cincinnati, they did play hard against Atlanta United, and knowing the fact that Chicago is a team that has just struggled on the road with a capital S, I'm not quite sure, you know, where can they of course get all 3 points in this game. And let's also not forget to mention the fact that despite the fact that Chicago of course won 4-0 to FC Dallas at home in the last match, they actually lost to FC Cincinnati at home earlier this season, and that they definitely do not want to have the same fate of what Montreal did a couple of weeks ago, which is they of course got swept by FC Cincinnati in the season series. So yeah, that obviously is something that is also on the line of the that you don't want to join a just an embarrassing kind of stat line of losing FC Cincinnati both time when you face against them. But you know, especially with Chicago now in a playoff hunt, and that, you know, if they do not win this game against FC Cincinnati, and if they do not take advantage of the free points that they're going to get, I am once again starting to have doubt in terms of Chicago chances of making the playoffs. And before I move on into the next game, one other thing that I also want to mention is that FC Cincinnati is actually 1 goal away from conceding the most goal ever in a single season. They're currently tied with Orlando City with conceding 74 goals this season, and that if they do concede 1 more goal, they will officially own the mark as the worst defensive team in league history. And there's no doubt that they're going to break this. Like, I just don't see how they can go on a 3 games spell without conceding a goal. And that I also said before, I think this could be the first MLS team to concede 80 plus goal this season, which is just incredibly bad with the way that your defense should not be conceding that many goals in a single season. But moving on into the next match, and you know, me talk about this New England versus RSL game and how it connects to these two games. Well, you know, in this game, obviously for New England, they definitely want to win this game against RSL, so that, you know, if they of course win this game, they not only would keep on the pressure with Orlando City and Chicago of them have to win their game so that they can keep pace in terms of that playoff race, but they will also maintain that 1 game in hand that they have over those 2 teams that they currently are are trying to fend off for that last playoff spot. And keep in mind, that game in hand will come in the midweek action. And I forgot who exactly they play in the middle of the week. Actually, I can check right now very quickly who New England is playing in terms of the midweek games. They are playing against the Timbers on the road. So another team that is in desperation in terms of needing to get a point or get all 3 points in a game. Certainly, you know, that despite the fact that they, of course, do have that game in hand to play so that they can get some advantage against Chicago and Orlando City for that last spot. You know, that game in hand and to play on the road against a team that I know have not been very good at home and shockingly have not been very good at home again. That is the Portland Timbers. It still is a place that you definitely don't want to have like your game in hand and hope that you can take advantage of that game in hand in one of the toughest environment to play in MLS. But, you know, talking strictly about this game against RSL and that, you know, New England, of course, they drew 3-3 against Orlando City in the last game, while RSL, of course, lost 3-1 to Minnesota away. And that as much as New England has a lot to fight in this game, RSL also have a lot of fight in this game too, and that in many ways, I think when you look at this match, I'm pretty sure a lot of Western Conference team is going to be rooting for New England in this game because this is an East versus West clash, and as I mentioned before on the preview, whenever there's an East versus West clash that has happened, and that you're one of those teams that is between 2nd through 8th in that logjam of a Western Conference playoff race, you always root for the Eastern Conference team to able to beat that team that is part of that log jam in the Western Conference playoff race. Whereas, you know, for RSL, you know, or for teams like Orlando City and Chicago, they will definitely be rooting for RSL in terms of getting a win, because if New England do lose this game and Orlando City and Chicago gain point on New England, then all of a sudden they would actually be tied for that last spot of the playoff race. So there's definitely, you know, not only both of these teams have a lot at stake, and just to briefly talk about what is really at stake and why this game is important for both of the team, you know, I already mentioned the fact that New England is 3 points ahead of Chicago and Orlando City for that final playoff spot, but RSL, despite the fact that they're in 4th place of the Western Conference, they're only 3 points ahead of the red line, and that if they lose this game against New England and that other team below them is able to get a win, they could easily find themselves dropping all the way near the bottom of the playoff kind of standing, and that they could find themselves just inches away from potentially missing the playoffs. So there's a lot of stake for RSL in this game too, and I mean, overall, I think whoever wins this game is going to be that team that really wants playoffs more. I mean, I think if I really need to see who exactly has a little bit of an upper hand in this game, because overall I think this is a relatively even matchup. I think New England might have a little bit of an upper hand, considering the fact that, one, they're playing at home, which at home this season they have been pretty good, whereas RSL, when they go on the road, they have definitely not been as good as they are at home. So, you know, I would give New England kind of that edge in terms of that department, but overall this should be a very even matchup, and that not only this game has a lot of stake in terms of both team of where they're in the playoffs, but I'm pretty sure other team are also watching this game knowing that there's a lot of stake in terms of this game that could tell the story of their outcome of where they're going to be at the end of the week in terms of this playoff race. Now, moving on into the next game, and that, as I said, with the FC Cincinnati versus Chicago game, that is connected to this one and have some that has connection with the playoff implication. It's the same thing with Houston versus Orlando City, you know, and similar to Chicago versus FC Cincinnati, Orlando has a very winnable game against the Dynamo. Although I would say maybe this one is a little bit harder because Orlando, you know, they're playing against a Dynamo team that, while they have definitely not been as good at home as they have shown in past year, they're still a team that, of course, can able to win at home. And they're basically just kind of playing the spoiler road in terms of of trying to spoil some of these teams that is in the playoff race. And, oh, by the way, Houston, they are going to be eliminated from the playoffs if they get a draw and a loss in this game. So, at least maybe that can fuel them and say that, you know, if we're going to keep maybe a grain sand of a hope of making the playoffs, we better win this game against Orlando City. So, yeah, this should be a bit of an interesting kind of matchup, and that, you know, I think for Orlando City, you know, if they want to make the playoffs, which, you know, I know I've heard a couple of Orlando City fans that have already started to give up the fact that, you know, after that draw against New England, it looked like the playoff hope is all but done. But if they can win this game against Houston, and if New England drop their resort over the weekend against RSL, then they're only 1 point back of New England for that last spot, and that all of a sudden they are right back into the thick of things. But the important thing is they need to win this game. But moving on into the final game of the preview on this board before I switch the board is SKC versus Colorado. So speaking of grains of hope in terms of making the playoffs, that's what SKC is in right now, because this game is an absolute must-win for SKC, and that if they do not win this game against the Rapids, I think their chances of making the playoffs is pretty much done. And although I think they won't be eliminated in this game if they do lose this one, and that, you know, as long as if other team around them aren't able to get resort, and the teams that is currently in above the playoff line doesn't get the resort done, they could still be mathematically alive even if they lose this one against the Rapids. But, you know, if you lose this game to the Rapids, even if you're mathematically alive, it's just going to basically say that you're one game away from getting eliminated. And as I said in the review in the last game, I kind of felt like SKC chances of making the playoffs could potentially be done, because, you know, they lost 7-2 to the Galaxy away, which was a sign of them clearly just giving up their hope of making the playoffs. And not to also mention the fact that they also come up of a heartbreaking 2-1 loss against Portland on the road. And when you have these two just gut-punching loss in a row, and that you are fighting for playoff position, that is definitely not a good recipe in terms of you better hope that you can rally your troops for these last couple of games, and that you just got to win out your last couple of games if you want to make the playoffs. And especially the fact that they are playing against a Rapids team that, you know, like Houston, they need to win this game if they want to avoid elimination. But the Rapids is a team that, as I said many times before, this is a spoiler kind of team. This team loves to play the spoiler role and love to ruin a team chances of making the playoffs. And that it's almost like they feed off that kind of thing. They get super excited the fact that they, of course, spoil someone's chances of making the playoffs. So, you know, this is definitely a very dangerous game for Sporting KC, and that, you know, for them, if they do not win this game, they could fall 10 points back of Dallas for that last spot with 3 games left to play, which means that they would be mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. While for the Rapids, you know, if they lose this game, they'll be 11 points back of Dallas if Dallas, of course, win their game, which also means that they would be mathematically eliminated with 2 games left this season. But that being said, I am now going to switch boards and look at the last 6 games that's going to be happening in match week number 30. But yeah, either way, moving on into the next game is the Galaxy taking on the Montreal Impact. So the Galaxy currently have a record of 14-4-13, and the Montreal Impact currently have a record of 11-4-16. The Galaxy, of course, they got a huge win at home, and when I mean huge, I mean they absolutely smacked Sporting KC out of their home ground by beating them 7-2 at home. While Montreal, of course, they took an embarrassing 1-0 loss to FC Cincinnati at home. And as I mentioned, they unfortunately get the dubious honor to become the first team to get swept in a season series by FC Cincinnati. Now, I know I haven't been giving a lot of credit to Montreal in terms of the fact that they should be in the conversation as same as Chicago and Orlando City in fighting for that last playoff spot. I mean, after all, they're only 3 points behind New England for that last spot of the Eastern Conference playoffs, and they just got off a big win against TFC in that Canadian Championship first leg with a 1-0 win against TFC. However, one of the reasons why I am doubting the fact that Montreal might not be one of those teams that is going to join Chicago and Orlando City and New England to battle for that last spot is because, one, this game they have to literally go on a short weekend, have to travel all the way across the other side of the country to play against a Galaxy team that obviously is on a huge high note after winning 7-2 against SKC. And you also got to remember that Montreal has some very tough schedule coming for the remaining part of the season. So they're not like Chicago and Orlando City where they have a relatively easy schedule and that, they of course could be in the playoff hunt. Now, I will definitely want nothing but Montreal to kind of prove me wrong. The fact that yes, they are potentially still in that playoff race and that they might be at the final day of the season, might be one of what would be 4 teams that is chasing for that last spot in the playoff race. But knowing the fact that when you look at how things have gone wrong for Montreal, and that it seemed like right now they're putting all their eggs in the basket in the Canadian Championship, and that if they win that one, I don't think they really care if they make the playoffs or not, because not only they won a trophy, they get to play in the CONCACAF Champions League next season. So yeah, that's also probably the biggest reason why, maybe they're not going to be one of those teams that's going to be in the conversation. And if you minus the 1-0 win against TFC in the Canadian Championship, they has just looked absolutely terrible for a while now. And that 1-0 loss to FC Cincinnati at home pretty much is the low point of so far of what has gone on with this team, just completely capitulating in the last couple of months. Now, whereas for the Galaxy, they're currently in 5th place and they're 2 points above the red line. And there is no doubt that the Galaxy want to win this game so that they, of course, can potentially start a stretch where they can start winning some of their remaining games to not only be in a position of making the playoffs, but in a position where they could get home field advantage in the first round of the playoffs and could come into the playoffs as one of the hottest team, because the Galaxy have some very easy schedule coming up with them playing against the likes of Houston and Vancouver coming up, and that you could maybe say Montreal is another team that you would think that they should be winning after what happened in the last game where they were able to win 7-2 against SKC. But the thing is, my question with this team is still, can they find that consistent kind of stroke? And that, I still don't trust the fact that, I know they won 7-2 against SKC. I know that was just incredible kind of performance. But the thing is, they kind of did the same thing to LAFC a couple of weeks ago, where they were able to get a free draw in that game, and they were definitely thinking that, yep, this team could definitely be able to handle the best team and able to keep pace with the best team in the league. And then after that, they once again go back to losing games. So I hope that with that big 7-2 win against SKC might be a chance where they could start make a run with all these easy games left this season and started to get themselves climbing in the Western Conference. But at the same time, there's still definitely doubt with. Now, one thing that might boost their chances of potentially getting up in the Western Conference and win all those easy games is not only the fact that they, of course, have Zlatan and Christian Pavone on their team, but they're also gonna get back Roman Alessandrini in this team for the remaining of the season. And for those of you that think, who is Roman Alessandrini? Yeah, that's the guy that went down early in the season. And the fact that, it's been such a long time since he is not in the squad, it's almost like a new signing for the Galaxy. It's almost like if the Galaxy just once again decide to kind of cheat the system and decided to bring in their DP back, and that, he could definitely make an impact to his team. Now, speaking of him making an impact to this team. The question is, would he be back 100% healthy? And that we've seen before where players suffer long injury when they come back and playing competitively, they take a while to try to get back to full strength. So, maybe if Alessandrini, in these next couple of games, if he can get his confidence back, and, I think the good thing about the Galaxy, as I mentioned, with the easy schedule that they have down the stretch, is that if he can get some confidence and score some goals against these easy opponents, then yeah, that's another weapon that the Galaxy had heading into the playoffs, and I'm pretty sure no one want to play against a team that had Zlatan, Pavone, and Alessandrini as the three-headed monster, and also not to mention Jonathan Dos Santos in the midfield. Speaking of LA, the other LA team, LAFC, is going to also be playing in a pretty big match this week, as they are going to be playing against Toronto FC in this game. LAFC, of course, their record is 19-7-4, while TFC is 12-9-10. But LAFC have actually now gone 4 games without a win, which is the longest stretch that they have not got a win. Which, I have no problem with it, and I know people might think, well, is it panic time for LAFC with them gone on a winless run heading into the playoffs? The only time I think I could really be very concerned with LAFC heading into the playoffs is the fact that if this winless run continues. Now, it's not going to be easy to end this winless run because they're going to be faced against a team that is quietly become one of the hottest teams in the league. That is Toronto FC, who is unbeaten in 7 games. And in terms of the playoff implication, LAFC, of course, can clinch a supporter shield with a win and an NYCFC loss, which it seemed like that's been the case for the last couple of weeks, but because of the fact that LAFC wasn't able to win those games, that's why they weren't able to clinch their supporter shield a couple of weeks ago. While TFC, of course, they're currently tied with DC United for 4th place, and the reason why I implicate 4th place is because that is the last spot in terms of getting at least a home game in the playoffs. So certainly TFC want to hold on to that position so that they can at least have a home playoff game at BMO Field. And it's definitely not going to be easy to be facing against an LAFC team that certainly they have been very good this season, and that, I'm pretty sure Vela should be back to his full strength and start scoring goals again. And I also won't be surprised if this game is going to end in a very high scoring action, because both of these teams have very good attack and both of these teams know how to score goals. So don't be surprised if this game is going to end like 4-3 or 5-3 kind of matchup. But moving on, in terms of the next match, boy oh boy, for this has to feel like a must-win game for the Timbers. And I know we're not at that point of the season, or not really at the last day of the season, where if Portland is still find himself right below the red line and looking outside, and that they have to win if they can climb up the red line. This game does feel like it's a must-win, with them playing against a Minnesota team who have a record of 14-6-10, and they of course won 3-1 against RSL at home. And for Portland, their record is now 13-4-13, and the fact that Portland, I talk about how they are just struggling at home like nothing I've ever seen with this Timbers team in previous year when they're playing at home at Providence Park. And especially when you look at the last 6 games that they have been playing at home, they lost 4 out of their last 6 games. And as I mentioned in the review, even in the wins that they had in these last 6 home games have not been pretty, and that it could have easily end up to be a loss if things didn't actually go their way with a stoppage time winner, and also their opponent wasn't able to put the ball into the back of the net. And that because of that, they have now found themselves 1 point below FC Dallas with a game in hand, and that game in hand does come this Wednesday, when they are going to be once again playing at home, and I believe they're playing New England at home in the midweek games. Well, for Minnesota, they're currently 3rd in the standings, and they're 5 points above the red line, and that they could actually get up to 2nd place if they are able to win this game, and that maybe Seattle can drop their resort against DC, and that they can of course get into 2nd place and get even a game in hand over Seattle well, they actually have a game in hand over Seattle for those positions. So if they of course can win their game in hand, then they could actually be in a very promising kind of position. But I think overall this game, it's all about the Timbers, where they just got to win this game. And it's definitely not gonna be easy against Minnesota, which is a team that they already lost twice this season. Once earlier this season in the league, and then the other time in the U.S. Open Cup semifinal. But if they want to just not go on this kind of capitulation that I'm started seeing with this team, and that as long as if they don't figure out that midfield and that attack, and as long as if you have that team just aren't able to score goals and aren't able to contribute, I have a lot of concern with this Timbers team, and that they could really miss the playoffs this season. And if they miss the playoffs this season, this would have been arguably one of the biggest collapse we have ever seen in MLS history, and that they could arguably go down as one of the best teams to not make the playoffs heading into this season. Because when you look at that squad, it's clear that squad should not be a squad that should be battling for the last spot in the playoffs, and that it should be a squad that should be challenging in the top part of the Western Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, and speaking of battling for the last spot of the playoffs and battling for those last couple of spots in the Western Conference, FC Dallas is in that situation, as they of course are facing against NYCFC. Their record is 12-8-11, and they're currently just only 1 point above Portland, and that Portland does have a game in hand over them. While NYCFC, they're currently 16-9-5. They of course won 2-1 against the Quakes at home, while Dallas drew 0-0 to Seattle. And for NYCFC, they also kind of have something to play for, considering that they want to lock up that top spot in the Eastern Conference and want to get that first round bye, as they're currently 5 points ahead of Philly for the top spot of the Eastern Conference. And I think when you look at this game, and when you look at those three teams that's battling for the top spot for the playoffs, maybe this one is the easiest game out of the three team that is facing their opponent. Because I know Dallas at home has been very good, but it's definitely a team that hasn't looked that good. Well, they kind of looked good a couple of weeks ago, and then they had obviously the 4-0 collapse, followed by a kind of toothless performance against a Sounders team that wasn't even starting their strongest starting 11 at home. So yeah, they definitely is kind of started to look like a team that maybe has started to be that classic Dallas team, which is late in the latter part of the season. They are started to choke away their chances of making the playoffs. So, NYCFC, especially how good they have been, you would think that they should be getting a result out of this one and should get all 3 points. But I know Dallas probably is going to try to make it hard on them. And I won't be surprised if this is going to be a low-scoring game, because, as good as NYCFC has been this season, they're not a team that is known to just blow team out of the game. Like, when you look at the wins that they had in the last couple of games, it's been all one-goal game. It's been relatively close, but they've been just kind of grinding out resort, which is kind of what the same can be said about Dallas with them, is a team that loves to just kind of grind out resort too. So I won't be surprised if this is going to be a low-scoring game. And because, as I mentioned before, because this is a East versus West kind of matchup, for a fact that if you're one of those teams that is in that logjam of the Western Conference, you better root for NYCFC. And I'm pretty sure Portland fans, after they watch that game against Minnesota, whether win or lose, they'll be rooting hard for NYCFC to able to get a win against Dallas, so that they can climb themselves back above the red line. Now, moving on into the next match is going to be Philly against the Red Bulls on the road. Now, the Red Bulls currently have a record of 13-5-13, while Philly currently have a record of 15-7-8. And I think there's no doubt that this is probably maybe the game of the week, considering the fact that both of these teams are coming into this game on a pretty high note. The Red Bulls, of course, they won 2-0 to Portland away in their midweek games, while Philly, of course, drew 1-1 against LAFC at home, and they really went toe-to-toe with the best team in the league at home. And just to add a little bit extra spice in this game, you could maybe say that this is also a rivalry game too, because this is a game between two teams that is in close proximity in terms of geography, and that some people even say this is maybe the I-95 derby, with both of these cities separated just by I-95. And in terms of the playoff implication for the Red Bulls, they're currently 1 point below TFC for 4th place, and that they're actually 7 points ahead of Orlando or Montreal for in terms of the red line, and that I'm pretty sure most likely they're gonna make the playoffs after they, of course, got that huge win against Portland. And I think if they win this game against Philly and that Montreal does not get a point, or actually no, if they do win this game against Philly, they will officially clinch their playoff spot. And that, you know, I know that they will be definitely happy the fact that they, of course, have clinched their playoff spot, but there's no doubt that they are trying to get themselves a home playoff game, as so far when you look at the standings right now and how tight it is in terms of that standings of fighting for that last spot, but to get at least a home playoff game in the first round, the Red Bulls certainly want to win against the Union. Although the Union definitely wants to win this game because they want to get a first round bye, and that they want to keep the pressure on NYCFC in terms of getting that first round bye, and that they're one of those 3 teams that I mentioned alongside with Atlanta and NYCFC that is battling for that top spot and battling for that spot of potentially getting a playoff bye in the first round of the playoffs. But moving on into the final game of this weekend is DC versus Seattle. So talking about how the Red Bulls is one of those teams that's fighting for that last spot of at least getting one game at home in the playoffs. DC is kind of that team too, as they of course are tied with TFC for 4th place in the standings, and they of course also beat the Timbers away. They win 1-0 against the Timbers, which was back last Sunday. Now, they are going to be facing another Cascadia team. This time, it's going to be the Seattle Sounders, who has a record of 14-8-9. And they, of course, drew 0-0 to FC Dallas at home. And as I mentioned before in this game, Seattle, they didn't really put out their strongest starting 11. And I think I probably didn't mention that in the review. And I probably should have mentioned that, because maybe that will just kind of... If I would have known that Seattle wasn't starting their strongest 11, I wouldn't think that result would be as bad as they drop points at home. But still, it's kind of strange the fact that he decided to rest his guy when they're playing a game at home against a Dallas team that is one of those teams that is currently in that logjam of a Western Conference. And that this really puts a lot of emphasis on this game, and the fact that, if you rest your guys during the middle of the week, and that you kind of almost give away those points to FC Dallas in that game by resting some of those guys, you better hope that you win this game against DC. Because if you do not win this game against DC, and those guys that was well rested for this match weren't able to put on a good shift, despite the fact that they weren't part of the midweek game, and that they don't have to deal with playing on a short rest and while traveling to the other side of the country, there's going to be definitely a lot of heavy criticism. And that, at this part of the season, and especially how it feels like every game is very important, I think this was a huge gamble that Schmertza put, and I generally kind of don't like the fact that he decided to put that much of a gamble of the fact that right now we're into a time where you just cannot afford to rest guys unless you are in a very comfortable position in the playoffs, and that you're pretty much locked of where you are in the standings right now. And that Seattle, of course, they're currently 7 points above the red line and 2 points ahead of Minnesota at 3rd place, and that they are definitely looking comfortable in terms of making the playoffs. But keep in mind, they also want to have home field advantage, and that they're actually, I think, 4 points ahead of the team that's currently in the last spot of a position where they at least can get to host one game at home in the playoffs. So, you know, it's not really a big gap in terms of them guaranteed to host a playoff game. So, you know, this is going to be interesting for the Sounders. And, you know, when you go back to this game against DC, DC is definitely a team that wants to carry that momentum from Portland, where, you know, it was a massive victory for them, and that they want to carry that momentum heading at home so that they can get a big win against Seattle. And now all of a sudden they could set up to be a team that may be a dark horse heading into the playoffs and in a very good momentum. But yeah, it's going to be a very interesting game, and we shall see who, of course, would win this one. But either way, guys, hope you guys enjoy this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash that subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time. And oh, by the way, let me know in the comments below, what do you think your prediction is for all 12 of these games? But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.